Well, thank you very much for the kind introduction, and thank you for having me. Ted Smith, who I believe used to teach here, he and I were having a conversation the other day about why he likes to work on B-listers, and B-listers are his zone. And I was saying that as an independent scholar, which is what I effectively am now, I have to deal with A-listers. I have no choice about that. So that's the pricing issue is a commentary on that, not quality. So what I'm doing here, I slightly wimped out of the big idea of trying to link this discussion of great critics and unbelievers and what they have to say to a Christian culture that has propensities to violence. So that's the elephant in the room, in the same way that Voltaire wrote his letters on England and really was writing about France. There's a pretty large American subtext here, but I'm not going to rush in there prematurely. So forgive me for sort of working on material that is mainly published, but these are the things I want to develop. The Russia thing is not something I'm sort of equipped to do as a sole researcher, but I put together a team of scholars, and one of the things we're looking at is just the way in which the Soviet system created a mythological consciousness. How does violence get justified under prevailing set of myths? And that's the link to this project. People like Spinoza, Pierre Bayle, Feuerbach. And I have to mention this. I was listening in the car on the way up to James Bird's excellent book on sacred scripture, sacred war. And the phrase that stuck in my head was that war requires both violence and discourse. He quotes a historian who says, war involves wounds and words. And that is a perfect introduction, really, to what I think is the value of someone like Voltaire or Spinoza, that ability to challenge the Christian and say, when you're talking about God, are you absolutely sure you're not talking about yourself? A theocracy is a meocracy, says Feuerbach, or words to that effect. So what I want to do is try to claim some of these thinkers as Christian sort of dissident prophets in a way, and to get away from a sort of us and them psychology of secularization. Voltaire is probably the most misunderstood of these thinkers, and you can reel off the hyperbole that his work has generated over the years. And there's a story about Coleridge being caught by headmaster reading the philosophical dictionary, and the teacher proceeded to flog the infidelity out of him. Coleridge said it was the only just flogging he ever received. And then the Dean of King's College London in 1830 described Voltaire as comparable to Judas Iscariot among the supreme representatives of impenitence. To admire Voltaire is a sign of a corrupt heart, said Joseph de Maistre, and you can go on. More recently, scholars like Peter Gay have seen Voltaire as the symbol of the rise of a modern paganism. And you can read off many biographers who've said this kind of thing, saying that Voltaire is either a agnostic or an atheist. So I'm going to dispute that. I'm going to accept that he is the major critic, possibly the preeminent critic of Christianity of the modern era, but I'm going to show or try to demonstrate that his ideas are motivated by Christian values. So first of all, natural law. How natural is natural law? I'm going to argue his deism is in fact strongly informed by Christian ideas. I'm trying to feed some of this research into a response to William Kavanagh's book, The Myth of Religious Violence, who presents a very view of the Enlightenment account of religious violence. I'm going to try and argue that he's very specific in his critique, Voltaire. Like Spinoza, they both have a very clear idea of what is meant by superstition, and in Voltaire's case, it's Augustinian, it's Jansenism, hyper-Augustinian theology. Then I'm going to argue that Voltaire's doctrine of conscience, Christian as it is also quite evangelical in its own way, in its need for grace. Respond a bit to people like Charles Taylor. If you've read A Secular Age, he talks about deism and the eclipse of grace, and it's all this one-way slide. I'm going to argue otherwise. And then just a little bit about this enigmatic question of what Voltaire thinks about Jesus. So really 4 sections in a short short conclusion. Okay, so who was Voltaire? Voltaire was born in 1694 and educated by Jesuits at a prestigious school in Paris. Most of his youth, he was convinced his father wasn't his real father. His schooling and his youth are a series of kind of arrests, exiles. He's constantly in trouble from a young age. Most famous exile is to England between 1726 and 1729. And there he assembles the materials for his philosophical letters, or letters on the English, which is said to be the first missile thrown at the Ancien Régime in France. He's been writing poems and plays from his youth, but he turns in this period, in the 1730s, to history, science, and a new genre that he essentially pioneers, which is that of the philosophical tale, the conte. And some of you will know his most famous, which is Candide. Candide radiates this abhorrence for religious violence that is found in most of Voltaire's work, but most famously or controversially, it introduces a critique of philosophical optimism, a sort of shallow, optimistic kind of rationalism that thinks the world is getting better and all evil is part of some great design plan for good. The final 2 decades of Voltaire's life are probably his most influential. In the 60s and 70s, he's a massive spanning career, really, of 60 or 70 years of published writing. He throws himself into the war on intolerance. Crush the infamous becomes his kind of catchphrase. He writes the Treatise on Toleration, Philosophical Dictionary, and a number of pamphlets. He just doesn't give up. He's writing into his 80s, The Cry of Innocent Blood. And there's a great quote from Diderot about how he envied Voltaire his role in the famous Calas affair. Calas was a Protestant accused of murdering his son in a horrible sectarian setup, and Voltaire picks up the case and has the family exonerated. And when he returns to Paris in the year of his death in 1778, he's feted on the streets as the defender of Calas. And Voltaire had said Diderot had said many years earlier, he envied Voltaire his role in the exoneration of Calas more than any of his literary works. That is what made him this iconic figure in France, and admired very much. He had many clerical admirers as well as sort of radical philosophical admirers. Okay, so natural law. The standard view has been to say, well, Voltaire's a deist, and deists believe in reason over revelation, and it's icy and cold, and it's kind of de-Christianized theology. In fact, recent work on deism has shown that it is the boundaries between orthodoxy and heterodoxy and deism blur. People like John Toland, Christianity Not Mysterious. This work has been described as just a reforming dissenter work. That you get a series of Protestant arguments against the priesthood applied to the clergy in general, and Voltaire sort of fits into this model. He picks up a lot of this work in the 1720s, and then in his visit to England. But most importantly, Voltaire's deism is informed by his Jesuit education, and this is where I really defer to René Pommeau in his book Voltaire's Religion. He says that Voltaire, brilliant student of the Jesuits, he learnt rather well from his school teachers, who were essentially the college Louis le Grand was essentially a nursery of reaction to Jansenism, which is the hyper-Augustinian sect, and the emphasis of his education were all lifelong concerns for him: the importance of mercy over judgment, the importance of free will against predestination, and the positive credentials of conscience. Conscience is not just this dead weight, it actually has a positive religious value. And Pommeau talks about a certain heterodoxy germinating within the breast of orthodoxy. So this is a very important influence, and one of the radical teachers on the menu at the school was Archbishop Fénelon, who's a mystic, who drew on various sources, but his controversial idea was that God is a tender and compassionate father as well as a judge. That Voltaire is always quoting Fénelon, and he sort of sometimes pretends he's rediscovered him, but actually all along you can see these influences. So a little bit more about Voltaire's college conscience, the so-called natural law of Voltaire, who turns out to be not as natural as we think. The closest thing I found to my sort of argument here and to Pomo is Carl Becker's work, The Heavenly City of the 18th Century Philosophers. And it was written in 1934, I think. He adopted this sort of mocking tone towards the philosophes, saying, how comes it that you skeptics know so much about God? How comes it that you're so knowledgeable about the divine law? You know, nature talks about people deifying nature. Well, you know, where does this theology emerge from if it isn't, in some sense, Christian? Now, an example of Voltaire's high doctrine of conscience that really is his first sword that he lays to the root of orthodoxy is the poem on natural law. And that's interestingly, or rather importantly, just before the Lisbon earthquake and the Lisbon poem, which really shatters a lot of this confidence. But here's just one example of a quote from that. This theological language: did men create the sense of guilt or shame, their soul and faculties did mortals frame. He picks up a sort of mystical language in this poem. He talks about the conscience being a bright, ethereal spark of heavenly fire, a generous flame that makes the obstinate repent. And here you get a sense also of his critique of theology, because he says, well, if conscience is so powerful, why is it not arrested the progress of religious wars and pious rage? He says, well, certain theology has the capacity to kind of crush or smother conscience. And he defines fanaticism in the Philosophical Dictionary as the effect of a false conscience, which makes religion subservient to the caprices of the imagination and the excesses of the passions. So theology is sort of giving a green light to certain passions which conscience would normally regulate. Theology sort of creates a compassion filter almost. This is an idea in many of his works that the hero is a sort of untutored person, someone like Candide, someone characterized by candor, guileless good nature, and he loves to take a native Indian and to sit him down with a Jansenist and to try to unravel the complexities of theology by saying that nature is good. You know, the best way to think about Voltaire's doctrine of conscience is to see it as his doctrine of creation. The creation is good. And this idea of the moral compass disciplines most of his religious criticism, his critique of theology, his critique of the Bible, where ethics governs historicity to a large degree. I'll say a bit more in a second. So here's an example of this view of the purity of conscience and the warning not to smother. I've placed in each of your hearts a seed of compassion with which to help one another through life. This is his nature speaking, nature/God. Do not smother this seed, nor must you corrupt it, for it is divine. He writes to Frederick of Prussia, who's his sort of admirer and protector to some extent. I always reduce, so far as I can, my metaphysics to morality. He later discovers Spinoza as a confrère. He initially thinks Spinoza is a total heretic, an atheist, and many other things. But that's exactly Spinoza's stance, as it happens. Metaphysics, the way you think about the fabric of the cosmos, is governed by notions of equity. So this is a constant theme for Voltaire, and he doesn't want to get too fancy with metaphysical ideas, because he says the things we just don't know, don't understand. He writes this most famously in the work of 1864, The Ignorant Philosopher. But what we do have is conscience. We do have this sense of right and wrong, and that must be preeminent. Fascinating to see his biblical criticism. He's seen as this great cynical destroyer, but it's a real kind of divide and rule policy. He is indignant about any notion of religious warfare, the idea that God is commanding people to slaughter other people. He hates the idea of God sort of pulling strings to perform miracles, to feed. You know, a classic line of Voltaire: if a wolf finds a sheep for its supper, it is not because God has given the wolf a particular grace. You know, that's this idea. God is not sort of a God of favors. He hates any notion of God tinkering to allow a kind of a religious slaughter or a holy war of any description. And yet, he holds fire when there's something that captures his, that meets his approval, something like the book of Ruth, where the love of God is not confined to the clan. Ecclesiastes is a favourite of his, and most of all, Joseph. Now, I've argued that his tale, Zadig, is pretty much, I wouldn't say plagiarised, but the story does bear a worrying resemblance to the story of Joseph. And in the Philosophical Dictionary, he absolutely raves about this wonderful story. He says it's more effective than the Odyssey, for a hero who pardons is more touching than one who avenges. Almost all in it is wonderful, and the termination exacts tears of tenderness. So this is the clue to my second main theme, which is unmasking superstition. That contrary to this view that Voltaire is a sort of indiscriminate destroyer, the theology he has in mind is very specific. It's a kind of agile wrath. It's a sort of uneven fury. And religion, when it's peaceable, is a very good thing for Voltaire. But he is convinced, and perhaps unfairly so, that most of the sectarian rancour tearing apart France in his time is driven by Jansenism. He takes the Jesuit side of it, although he later falls out with the Jesuits pretty much altogether. But critics of early plays point out that he's writing about Oedipus or Muhammad. What he's really writing about is Jansenism. Merciless gods, my crimes are your crimes. He's always trying to connect a theology of judgment and the behaviour of Christians. Voltaire was never really pedantic of citation, but in one of his historical works, he's quite specific in locating the ground of the quarrel between the Jansenists and the Jesuits. He says it's exactly the same as the Arminian Gomarist dispute in the Netherlands. It's over this question of predestination, and here's what he says. We read on page 165 of Jansen's book, Augustinus, that according to St. Augustine, Jesus Christ did not die for all men. This is an idea that troubled Voltaire from his childhood. Now, it may be significant that his brother Armand, who he never had a good word for, was a Jansenist. But for Voltaire, Jansenism is the joy of damning your brother on God's irrevocable authority. He is enraged by the psychology, the sort of gleeful psychology of predestination, and he reaches the conclusion that is what it is. It's a psychology. It is a sense of attaching divine mandates to a sort of, almost this kind of playground mentality. I mean, I could give dozens of examples of where he singles out Jansenism. At one point, someone's saying, which heresy does Islam most resemble? And he lists them all and says, no, it's Jansenism because of the degree of absolute predestination. When divine sovereignty is absolute, you have dangerous consequences, he argues. And it sounds petty, but there's a sort of consistency to this complaint. Now, one of the most interesting works of the early radical deistic Voltaire, before he softens, is this letter to Urania, which he writes to a young lover who is appalled by his impieties. And he says, no, I'm going to write this poem to show you that I'm not impious. He casts himself as a new Lucretius, tearing away the blindfold of superstition. But he also tries to defend the integrity of his stance. Now, this was the most clandestine of clandestine documents until he showed it to Jean-Baptiste Rousseau, whom he defended. And Rousseau shared it more widely, and he was in a lot of trouble for this. Rousseau had written a poem called Ode to Posterity, and the young Voltaire had responded by saying that he didn't think it would reach its destination. And this offended Rousseau, who shared Voltaire's own poem. Now, what does he say? He says the reason he was scared about this was that the poem is positively blasphemous. He talks about the god of superstition found in the sanctuary of religion, in the churches. He says this god is a tyrant whom we must hate. A god who had created us only to watch us decay, who'd invented guilt, only to invite punishment, a God who'd made us love pleasure, only to torment us with pain, a God who is prepared to lose us all. And then he says, yes, but what about Jesus? What about the cross? The poem screeches to its highest intensity at this point, where he says the cross is useless, inutile, because even now, not everyone would be saved. you suddenly realize that this is a very specific quarrel he's having with Christianity. He rages against the idea of applying words like clemency to a theology of terror, as he sees it. And then he says, forget Christianity. I'm going to show you the true God, the real God. And then the poem comes around almost to a prayer. My unbelief should not displease you. My heart is open to your eyes. I'm not a Christian, but it is to love you more. He goes on to say that this true God is one who consoles and enlightens, a God who has engraved a true law of righteousness on every heart. This God is not impressed by a proud, he takes more pleasure in a modest Buddhist than a ruthless Jansenist or an ambitious pontiff. So, we're back to the kind of point-scoring language again. But finally, he says, this true God, this deistic God, we can't offend him. If we can offend him, it is by our injustices. He judges us by our virtues and not by our sacrifices. And suddenly you think, well, this is perhaps less to play Lucretius than to paraphrase Jesus. I mean, most commentators admit that there's at least a biblical echo here. So this is the blistering, deistic Voltaire, and he's still drawing on this kind of biblical language to judge the God of Christianity. So what we see from this period on is that he becomes more and more Christian in his tonality, and then probably by the 1760s, he's drawing Jesus in explicitly and saying, okay, Jesus is a good theist, we like him. Okay, but before we get there, I just want to continue with this idea of Voltaire, the anti-Jansenist. That is his driving force. In the Philosophical Letters, he appends, I think, number 23, which is just a dialogue with Pascal. It has nothing to do with England. And this is where you get into the heart of his quarrel with this theology. He basically says that life is more than a death sentence. Creation is more than a cosmic blunder. And God is better. God is not some dice-rolling tyrant. God does not take pleasure in damning people for fun. And this is probably the purest Voltaire in a sense. He says, how can you, I'll just read these, how can you, without blushing, admit in God those very things for which mankind are judged infamous and are punished? If in your system God only came for so few people, if the small number of the elect is so terrifying, if I can do nothing at all by my own efforts, tell me, please, what interest have I in believing you? And then he kind of answers his own question. Have I not an obvious interest in being persuaded to the contrary? How can you have the effrontery? I mean, he's speaking to him as if he's a contemporary, but he's long dead, and it shows how these problems are niggling at him. How can you have the effrontery to show me an infinite happiness to which hardly 1 in a million has the right to aspire? If you want to convince me, set about it in some other way, and don't sometimes talk to me about games of chance, wagers, and heads or tails, or then sometimes frighten me by the thorns you scatter on the path I want to follow and must follow. Your reasoning would only serve to make atheists, were it not that the voice of the whole of nature cries out that there is a God with a strength as great as the weakness of those subtleties. So, dripping with biblical language, as you can see. The other text I would recommend, if you want to get the 10-minute introduction to Voltaire, would be the entry on original sin in the Philosophical Dictionary. And it opens with this great line that original sin is Christianity's original sin. He uses the Socinians, Quakers, Pelagius, and of course Jesus himself. And this is written in the 1760s, where he's a bit more on side, where he sort of says that if original sin were a true account of the human tradition, then the New Testament is a lie. Marriage would be a crime. Procreation would be a terrible thing to do. And he says, no, don't mistake the ideas of Augustine with the ideas of God. A man, he describes Augustine as at once debauched and penitent, Manichaean and Christian, tolerant and persecuting, who passed his life in perpetual self-contradiction. So Augustine really is the bogeyman for him. And he says Augustine has imputed to the entire human race his own anxieties. He essentially accuses Augustine of being a pagan, not really being at ease with the flesh. He said all this would be academic, were it not for the contemporary implications. He says, men have now attained such a degree of superstition that I can scarcely relate it without trembling. And he quotes the Jansenist theologian Pierre Nicole and says, shows how the theologian justifies in ponderous technicality how God has justified damning infants, that there's a tendency to concupiscence even before the act of sin, and how the evil lies in the will, not in the act. He gives him all the space and then says, cuts in, well said, Nicole, bravo, but in the meantime, why am I to be damned? That is the sort of essence of this quarrel. And people think it's superficial, but he says all along that ridicule is a weapon. He says whatever you can laugh at is no longer going to be dangerous. You know, he's very clear that just a sort of shallow tactic. It is an attempt to sort of, what we might say, almost historicize, just to kind of locate and deconstruct this great theological system. So I'm just going to give you three quotations that sort of sum up this stance, this supposed integration. And this is something I'd like your views on. Is this fair? This integration between the God of terror and intolerance. This is from Toleration and Other Essays. The superstition we must drive from the earth is that which, making a tyrant of God, invites men to become tyrants. And then from the Treatise on Tolerance, but in truth, do we know all the ways of God and the full extent of his mercy? Is it not permitted we should hope in him as much as fear him? Is it not sufficient to be faithful servants of the church? Must each of us presume to take upon himself the authority of God and decide in his place upon the eternal fate of our fellow men? Drawing heavily on Pierre Bayle, I should have mentioned earlier, the Huguenot philosopher who sketches many of these ideas in his historical and critical dictionary and in his philosophical commentary. The Treatise on Tolerance borrows these ideas and structures it as a critique of Augustine, who took the words of Luke's gospel, compel them to enter, as the justification for coercion. And then finally, this is the quote that I really used for my title, and this is, again, purist Voltaire, I see the mercy of God where you would see only his power. I tried to stitch together the common themes of Voltaire, Spinoza, Feuerbach, and Sebastian Castellio in the 16th century. And I found each of them is doing battle with this kind of nominalist or voluntarist theology, the idea of the God who is no man's debtor, the God who is sort of untethered by his own ethical rationality to an extent. And it's this nominalist theology that they're hammering away at all along. It's not just a blanket attack. Okay, so you could argue that this critique itself shows a Christian resonance, but what is even more interesting to me is how far Voltaire critiques his own natural law theology, his own natural, that isn't the contradiction, his own doctrine of conscience, by saying conscience is not enough. You need right understandings of God. You perhaps even need grace. And Voltaire famously hated Rousseau, and the two write these hilarious letters to each other, Sir, I do not like you. And they sort of niggle away. But the tipping point for Voltaire was when Rousseau publishes Émile, his soaringly moralistic work on education in 1762. And Voltaire is just infuriated that someone who gave away every single one of his children to an orphanage could have presumed to preach to people on parenting. And you might think this is a harsh line, but he writes this book, How Citizens Feel. And it's a absolute radical debunking of this sort of moralistic, it's sort of Alistair MacIntyre really, sort of this sort of motivist, is that the word? Ethical theory, where you just do what feels right. He says conscience is not enough. Conscience can lead you in some pretty terrible directions. He uses the provocative example of David in the Bible. He says David sometimes was smitten by his conscience, sometimes he was completely comfortable until Nathan comes along and sort of awakens his conscience. He actually describes his own ministry as that of awakening conscience, doing it rather better than most preachers do. And the line from that article that stuck in my head is, there is a natural law, but it is still more natural to many people to forget it. He develops his own sort of critique on the run. Now, there are scholars who say this is just a late development because he starts talking about it more articulately in the 1760s, but actually it's there all the way through. If you look at his epic poem, the Henriade, on Henry IV, the Clement King, who ended the wars of religion. It is resoundingly theological in that he describes his hero getting this sort of theological training. He describes him as seeking a greater boon than a crown, namely enlightened grace. And this anti-Jansenist theology is there on every page. God created us, says Henry. He wills all saved. Free in his gifts, to vengeance he sets bounds. When Henry comes back to Paris and he defeats and then forgives his enemies, Voltaire describes it as an offer to grace to these rebels who are rendered to life by Henry's kind commands, honouring their conqueror as the brilliant image of our God, the image of our God. And then he says that he describes him delivering food on the tips of those lances which had ever carried death. So you've got these sort of millennial images of kind of spears turning to pruning hooks and sort of swords to this sort of image of peace breaking out of symbols of war, weapons. He turns Henry into a saviour, melting the hearts of his enemies. And what I find crucial here is Voltaire's explicit recognition that natural law would have justified Henry in punishment. And you get this sense, this is why I've called it the science of mercy. He has this sense of almost Newtonian rhythm to punishment and vengeance, that it's perpetual. There is an endless ricocheting of violence. And the only thing that can break this is some sort of forgiveness. And he quotes Fenelon in a later work saying that, Fenelon's pure doctrine of pure love could render even Paris happy. But love is greater than judgment and just deserts. Another example of this is the play Alzire, Alzire or the Americans, set in Lima at the time of the Spanish conquest. And this is where you get this development of a three-level critique. You've got the religion of fear and vengeance. That is the conquering Catholicism that comes in and treats with the punitive and violent philosophy. Then you have the ancestral piety of natural law and just deserts, which is good but not good enough. And then you get this, what Voltaire sees as a true religion of mercy and forgiveness. So what happens is the governor of this colony, called Alvarez, realizes that he's been part of this ruling culture and he wants to repent. He's trying to train his son, Guzman, to be merciful. And Guzman doesn't want to hear any of it, and he antagonizes the natives, and Zamor, who's the leader of the natives, eventually wounds Guzman, and Guzman, only at the point of death, understands what his father's talking about, the necessity of that mercy is superior to vengeance. And it's a complicated and slightly fanciful story, but here's an example of what I would call the kind of the evangelical Voltaire. This is Guzman's speech at the point of death. The mask is off. Death has at last unveiled the hideous scene and showed me to myself. New light breaks in on my astonished soul. Oh, I have been a proud, ungrateful being and trampled on my fellow creatures. Heaven avenges earth. My life can never atone for half the blood I've shed. Prosperity has blinded Guzman. Death's benignant hand restores my sight. I thank the instrument employed by heaven to make me what I am. So he forgives Zamor, who at that point finally converts to Christianity and sort of gives he lays aside his attitude of vengeance. And twice in the play, Zamor has the opportunity to be forgiven for attacking Guzman, who died, and he rejects it. And his conscience is telling him that his honor has to be defended. And Alvarez says, "No, you scorn our proffered mercy." But finally, he sort of succumbs when he sees the sight of the dying son forgiving him. Now, Voltaire says that he wrote this with a view of showing how far the superior spirit of true religion is to the light of nature. And most scholars just laugh at this and say, oh, he's just pretending. But he kept coming back to this play, and it summed up just his sort of double critique, really, of religion of vengeance and a religion of power on the one hand, and a sort of religion of reciprocity, of justice. He says this does not actually solve any problem. And he talks in the same play about the God of orthodoxy being a European God who is a partial parent of one world and a tyrant over another. And he's saying, no, Christianity is universal. So it's a very Eurocentric feeling play, obviously, but it's powerfully Christian. So, as Pomo points out, really from the 1750s, Voltaire doesn't like to be described as a deist. He sees himself as the apostle of theism. I mean, nothing less than apostle, of course, for Voltaire, but he draws much more explicitly on positive Christian sources, the liberal clergy of Geneva. He exchanges a lot of ideas with English Socinians and most famously the Quakers. The Quakers he writes extensively about in the Philosophical Letters and later. He talks about the Quakers as the only example of peaceable conquerors, of peaceable settlers in America, the only settlers who have good relations with the Native Americans. He describes one Quaker community in America as an astonishing model of order and morals to every other society of Christians, the most just and the most inimitable of men. Again, scholars say this is just a foil for his critique of orthodoxy, but he wrote privately to a friend, "I will tell you that I love the Quakers." He says that if he could have endured the seasickness, he would have settled in Pennsylvania for the rest of my career. So you have this sort of counterfactual thought of Voltaire in America, had that actually come to pass. Now, the last text I'm just going to use before I move on to Voltaire and Jesus is this extraordinary book he writes in 1775, right at the end, The History of Johnny, or the Sage and the Atheist. Because at this point, he is in an all-out war with the atheists of people like Holbach, and he's still fighting the old war against the monster of intolerance. And he strikes this polemical strategy of showing how the two are mutually constitutive, which is kind of the thesis of my book, really, that he says that Holbach and Augustine are cousins, are philosophical cousins, because if you really make God out to be such a fierce judge, then you can understand why people go for the nuclear option of total unbelief. And he's saying that it doesn't have to be that way. And you've got these lovely scenes of this character sort of drawing on the worthy philosophers Penn and Locke. You know, he sees the Quaker William Penn and John Locke as just sort of kindred spirits. And his hero, the sage of the title, is introduced with inspired subtlety as friend. So he's a Quaker, he's a member of the English Parliament, and he's also an Anglican clergyman in this rather didactic and improbable romp. And I've argued that this is sort of really one of the finest pieces of religious apologetics of the century, because he confronts the arguments of the period in a very sort of powerful and quite a moving way. And I mentioned earlier something about Zadig being modelled on Joseph. The whole structure of this book is a sort of expanded version of the prodigal son. You've got this son who he's called Johnny because he's meant to be the sort of the dissolute son of an English aristocrat. He drinks a lot. He has a lot of unsuitable liaisons. He goes off to Spain and then steals some money, goes to America. And the main difference with the biblical story is that the father goes after him with the intention to restore my only son or bury myself with him. So there are many of these philosophical conversations interspersed with these improbable sort of skirmishes. And a classic scene is when he is, because this character is actually the grandson of William Penn, he is given a carte blanche in the New World. He's treated as a friend by the native Indians whose daughter Johnny has run off with, and he talks to the native Indians about their religion, and he gives probably the best summary of natural religion, which I'm just going to have to describe. Sorry, I haven't put it on the overhead. The chief of the group he's talking to says, "My God is there," he points to heaven, "my law is here," and he put his hand on his breast. And there's purity to this. But then they have the question of the killing of this woman, Mrs. Clivehart, who shot at one of them. She shot at one of them, she missed, and they killed her instantly. And Voltaire's hero talks them out of it. Why do you do this? He talks them out of this principle of a life for a life. And it helps that he's got the young atheist, the Holbachian atheist, sitting alongside saying it's fine, it's just a life, it means nothing. boiling your enemies is it's no different from cooking a chicken. You've got the spokesman for a crude materialist philosophy, and no one listens to the materialist. And Voltaire's character, his hero friend, finally persuades them to give up killing their people who commit crimes of that nature. Sorry, I'm really sorry I haven't put that quotation up. Voltaire describes it as a miracle greater than any of the miracles performed by the Jesuits in the New World. They swore by their great Manitou that they would not burn men and women again. Voltaire is constantly using Christian arguments to critique the natural law approach and to critique a sort of materialist atheism. And then he gets into this hilarious debate with a Bachelor of Theology in Spain. This is called the Dialogue of the Buts, because everything Friend says is met by a but, by this theologian. And when the theologian finally thinks he's trapped him, when Friend expresses doubt about the reality of eternal punishment, he comes out with a classic Voltairean defense. It does not become me to limit the compassion or the justice of God. I believe with Jesus Christ that we ought to love God and our neighbour, forgive our enemies, and do good for evil. These are the maxims of Jesus. Finally, in this bizarre text, I mean, it'll take you sort of an hour to read. He packs a lot of philosophy or a lot of theology into a short discussion. They get the boat back to England. Under star-spangled skies, they discuss the beauty of the cosmos and the likelihood that it's created. But then Burton, who's the young atheist, he's almost converted at this point, brings up the problem of evil. And Voltaire goes into this stirring defense of the divine character. He says that most evil, the diseases that depopulated North America, were unleashed by European settlers. Most violence in the world is caused by humans. He says men are perverse and make a detestable use of the liberty that God has given. And of course, Burton, the young atheist, starts quoting Augustine and saying that, yes, but there are earthquakes and we're all depraved, we hate each other. And he says, well, no, the African rhetorician spoke of earthquakes as he did the damnation of children, dying without baptism, with gross error and excess. If there be crime in the world, there is virtue as well. If there have been episodes of shame, from the abominations of Christians in Mexico and Peru to the St. Bartholomew massacre in France, had there not been people who have always held in abhorrence the shedding of blood? There's a point at which he almost sort of references himself as a providential thing, but he moves on and talks about the Quakers. Have there not been such people as those whom they attempt to ridicule by the name of Quakers, who have always hated war? Are there not places, and this is where it's poignant from an American point of view perhaps, are there not places such as the Carolinas, where the great Locke dictated laws, where all citizens are equal, all consciences are free, all religions good, provided they worship God? Then finally, his summary of, sorry, I think I'm just going in the wrong direction, that's my problem. Or I've made a mess. I'm really sorry about that. Here's the quote. He sums up his thesis of why there is evil in the world and God does not appear to stop it. He says, God, he lets the sun shine on the evil and the good. So there's a direct quotation really from the Sermon on the Mount. He considers this his crowning apologetic. He feels he's tied Holbach and Augustine together. And yet he's still accused of being an atheist and for writing this with some kind of, some sort of ulterior motive. And he writes to a friend, I've always regarded atheists as impudent sophists. I've said it, I've printed it. The author of Johnny cannot be suspected of thinking as Epicurus. So you have this constant dissonance between what he's trying to do and what people are saying about him. Okay, just very briefly, Voltaire's Christ. I was talking with David Bebbington, a historian, about my obsession with Voltaire and kind of going native with my sources, and he's saying, yes, but remember that plaque outside the church in Ferney where it's kind of God, erected to God by Voltaire, and the Voltaire is bigger than God on the plaque. And I said, well, there are more letters in Voltaire. But there is the sense of how much of this is just pure cynicism. Voltaire plays around with his bishop. He goes to Mass sometimes. He even preaches a sermon at Easter in 1766. And everyone thinks, well, he's playing games. And then one day he's banned from receiving confession. So he pretends to be on his deathbed so that a priest comes and hears his confession. Then he springs up and goes for a walk with his servants in the garden. So he's playing these games. But there is underneath it a strange respect that starts to germinate. That in the early works, in the clandestine works, he spoke very offensively about Jesus dying on a gibbet and about early Jewish writers being too distinguished to even mention a man like Christ. And then, as Pomos identifies, it just dries up. From the 1760s, he stops mocking and starts talking very favorably. He says it's not inconsistent with divine equity that God should have invested one person with more light and more talents than the other. That Jesus, perhaps, although he's not God to Voltaire, he has rare and perhaps unique light. A deist writer mocks the idea of Jesus healing the ear of the soldier after the Peter struck him. Voltaire says, well, hang on, at least this shows Jesus to be a man of peace. The most fascinating example that Pomo finds is that in the margin of Voltaire's own copy of Holbach's Christianity Unmasked, he finds the phrase, Voltaire protesting in his own writing, the morality of Jesus was not perverse. And he reproaches Holbach for exaggerating the evils of Christianity. In God and Man, God, Dieu et les hommes, he goes out of his way to defend the character of Christ. He says the greatest enemies of Jesus must admit that he possessed very rare qualities to attract disciples. Jesus, he says, had an energy, a force, and a tenderness that defied classification. There's an extraordinary little essay by Jacques Derrida, as it happens. He says about the Treatise on Tolerance, it says, really, Voltaire appeals to a particular Christian prerogative, a particular Christian duty that draws heavily on the Bible, that he's not just saying tolerance is a normal thing, that it's a specifically Christian virtue. And he says in many ways, Voltaire's Enlightenment is just as Christian as Kant's. And I sort of feel it more so. I feel that there's a strong doctrine of conscience, but there's a need to enlighten the conscience in Voltaire. And he sort of, Pomo's got this great phrase. He says, Voltaire is almost seized in his own conscience as to the Christian roots of his ideas. But, he holds back. I think Pomo still sort of understates it a bit. He talks about, that he loves the parable or the story of the Good Samaritan because it shows the outsider to be the true man of God, the Levite. When someone writes to Voltaire, says, why are you stirring up all this controversy with Calas and all these other cases? Let the dead bury their dead. Voltaire is indignant. He says, I found an Israelite in a desert, an Israelite covered in blood. Suffer me to pour a little wine and oil into his wounds. You are the Levite, leave me to play the Samaritan. He swear and says, voila, there's the religion of Jesus. And in that sense, I'm a Christian. And finally, just to give you this, the most extraordinary example, which of course most scholars say is just play acting. In the Philosophical Dictionary, which is his kind of compendium, modelled on the kind of Bale's dictionary, a bit of everything really. In the entry on religion, he includes a meditation. And the meditation starts off with someone staring up with Voltaire staring up at the starry host, wondering whether one born under Sirius would love and care as we do. Sorry, I don't know why I'm going ahead. There should be a gap between them. And anyway, he's taken up by an angel into the heavens to meet the sages of antiquity. And he has a short conversation with several of them, including Socrates. And then he's taken up into a higher level and finds someone whom he doesn't name. And the force of the passage is that he never names him. But he says, I saw a man of gentle, simple countenance who seemed to me about 35 years old. And he says, why had the priest put him to death? They saw that I knew them. He asks him a series of breathless questions. And finally, when Jesus affirmed his equal concern for the Jew and the Samaritan, Voltaire concerns with this sort of statement of this sort of homage. Well, if that is so, I take you for my only master. Then he made me a sign with his head, which filled me with consolation. The vision disappeared, and a clear conscience stayed with me. Now, out of context, this sounds a little bit brittle, perhaps a bit unconvincing, but Pomo points out this would be a very odd place in his flagship of dissent to put a sarcastic polemic. Now, the theology is never going to be orthodox with Voltaire, but he does seem to be able to write of Jesus with a certain kind of awe. He sees him as a friend in his ability to unmask. That is what Voltaire is all about. It's the exposing of another set of motives behind the facade of orthodoxy. And this is where in the treatise on tolerance, he says, look, who else preaches forgiveness and then forgives on the point of death? So this is, in a sense, an admission of where he's been all along, I think. He talks about Fenelon in similarly exultant, but not as exultant terms, and he has a sense of rediscovery. But I think you can see that even in his so-called deistic phase, there's a powerful undertow of kind of Christian architecture, or that's a totally mixed metaphor. He's leaning on that he doesn't really want to acknowledge. That's the idea you can get from Becker's book. And throughout his writing, he is incensed at the accusation of atheism. He doesn't like atheists at all, and he complains to Frederick in one of his many letters to him. He says, I've been persecuted ever since I wrote Le Henriade. Would you believe how often people have reproached me for depicting the St. Bartholomew massacre in such an odious light? I've been called an atheist because I said that men weren't born to destroy each other. Now, final point to make is just about his life. In my conversation with David Bevington about is any of this real, David was astonished to discover that Voltaire was attending Mass. He had a Jesuit priest, Father Adam, who lived in his chateau at Ferney, and he celebrated Mass frequently enough for his mistress to complain that he had nothing better to do than to go to Mass and play chess with Father Adam. And he writes a letter to a friend when the bishop discovers that this priest is living in his house. He immediately bans the Father Adam from saying Mass. He says to his friend here, I have with me, as I think you know, a Jesuit who's deprived of his right to perform religious services as soon as they found out he was living in my profane hovel. His bishop has been badly advised, for he risks making me die without confession, a misfortune for which I shall never be consoled. So you have this bizarre situation of this sort of hedonistic young man who becomes this sort of slightly monastic figure. He comes out with this great line that meal times will no longer be a time for convivial conversation. He says, not everyone has a useful fund of conversation. So he institutes a practice of august readings, of church history, sermons, and when visitors come from the Dijon Parliament, they have to sit in silence and listen to a sermon, which of course is all fun and games for Voltaire, but it actually happened. He had this kind of didactic regime. When he discovered that he enlists some local Franciscan friars to hear confession and say Mass for him, he discovers how poor they are. As John Coffey pointed out, perhaps not knowing that it was part of their theology, he raises a pension to support them. And immediately, or not immediately, a few months later gets a letter from the head of the order in Rome conferring on him the title of spiritual benefactor of the Capuchin order. And he's thrilled. He starts signing his letters, Friar Francois, unworthy Capuchin, thereafter. So this is typical of Voltaire. There is always a joke, but there is also a seriousness within it. And the final point is made by Owen Chadwick, who says that although the plan became obsolete because he died in Paris, he had very clear instructions for where his tomb would be in Ferney, because he'd reconstructed and refurbished the church. He had plans for a tomb that would be half in the church and half out. And as Chadwick put in his inimitable understatement, he often did things in jest, but seldom in jest only. So Voltaire now lies in the Pantheon in Paris, this great temple of secularism, which is, of course, appropriately a converted church. That's the photograph I took, is from there, where he and Rousseau kind of stare at each other in silence. Two great symbols of secularism, but they're more than that. And I just want to finish with a final quote from one of his many clerical admirers, because there was a school of thought in the 19th century that Voltaire was actually a prophet, that he had breathed life into a slumbering church. And I'm not going to read this in French, but have a look at the French, and I'll translate it in my own little way. God, by a diabolical ruse, sent Voltaire to combat his church, to regenerate it. History, we might say, is always more interesting than myth. Thank you very much.
Thank you. So let's have a conversation about this. So you can stay up here. And, any questions or comments?
Let's get some water.
Very, very interesting. I'll just kick it off and maybe we can kind of get this thing rolling. So what's the cash value? So you have kind of presented a picture that seeks to revise a sort of a traditional notion of Voltaire as a kind of a, rightly kind of deserving of being in the pantheon of secular atheism. So what have we, it's very fascinating stuff, all of this, but what's the cumulative payoff for you? Especially in light of this book that you just
Okay, thanks. For me, it was, Jeff Cox is a historian I admire a lot. He's gone on for years about how we need to eradicate the word secularization, and that it's just a blanket term that really sort of forces history into a mold. Now, I thought, no, there are times when you can talk about secularization, but my deconversion moment was when I discovered Pierre Bayle. And Bayle's philosophical commentary, which I knew, everyone quotes Bayle in the 18th century, Hume, Diderot, Holbach, Voltaire. He is seen as the firecracker thinker of the late 17th century. And I discovered his philosophical commentary, and I thought, this is a Bible study. The Christian passion of it, and the way he talks about defending, if we can't defend Christianity, we can defend its adorable founder. And he uses the word infamy. You think, Voltaire had an eye for this language. I thought any movement that is influenced by Bayle is, at least 3 or 4 parts to 10 Christian. And the depths of, then I had this idea that, there's a secular appropriation of these ideas. But when does an idea become secular? We were talking earlier about Martin Luther King, his eclecticism, the way he can draw on psychology and lots of secular thinkers. And then I read Peter Gay, and he says of Montesquieu, while there may be doubts about Montesquieu's paganism, there may be none about Voltaire's. And I started to sense this sort of conspiracy in the literature, and then more recently people like Jonathan Israel talking about Bayle and Spinoza. You realize both sides, the theological side and the secular side, both want to sort of construct separate channels of historiography and to kind of other the other. Sure. And Voltaire's not orthodox. Sometimes, he is blasphemous. But I like this idea of the diabolical ruse, that there could be a divine energy at work within the so-called secular thinker. So payoff, this is about unbelief still, but there's no single narrative of secularization for me.
Okay, that's very helpful. Okay, great.
So Locke and Rousseau and Voltaire all love to use the Americas and India in their arguments. And I'm curious to what extent they figure in Voltaire, in your reading, as Edenic, and to what extent they are sort of in a state of nature, or something more complex.
Yeah, I definitely say in something like the Huron, or the ingenuous one, as Voltaire calls it, there is that sense of real purity. I forget when he wrote that, and it must be before Candide. Candide is when, Candide is much darker. There isn't such the world is grim, there is suffering, and it concludes with this idea we just need to cultivate our garden. It's sort of Edenic, but also anti-Edenic in its own way. Yes, there's no doubt that Voltaire had a very naively optimistic view of certain parts of America, but he certainly critiques it as well as he goes, and particularly that later one, the idea that he's sort of very didactic in his approach towards the native Indians, that justice can only go so far. So it's naive, but I'd certainly say it's more than a foil. It's more than just a literary device.
One of the things I was wondering about as you were talking is, Voltaire being really upset by these accusations of him being an atheist. And I'm wondering, in Voltaire's mind, is there a connection between atheism and moral dissoluteness? Because I know this is this is a trope in the early modern period, but I'm also thinking of someone like the Marquis de Sade,
Yeah.
So I was just wondering if you could speak a little bit to that and how Voltaire perceived human relationships and morality.
Yeah, he really does, and I should have said that a bit more with his idea of Burton and this dissolute behaviour is absolutely linked to the influence of if God doesn't exist, everything's possible sort of thing. That it's that he does see it as linked to that radical, and he sees it as a great harm to the cause of philosophy to be identified with libertine lifestyles, and there's a sort of seriousness to his own praise of eating and drinking and the body. It is a sort of anti-Manichaean strategy. It's not hedonistic in a flippant way. So it's important, and this is where he parts company with Bayle, because Bayle gets himself in trouble when he says in his thoughts on the passing comet, that a society, he says, faith is often no more than idolatry, and actually a society of atheists could be just as ethical, if not more so, than a society of Christians. And that he gets blown out of the water for that. And Voltaire thinks he's too kind towards atheists, definitely. So yeah, that's the subtext. He talks about the poison of atheism, or it's the third imposter sort of thing. So he sees it as pernicious. But I think it's more than just, people always quote the kind of, if God didn't exist, we'd have to invent him. People just think that's a sign of his cynicism, but it's more than that. Don't talk about atheism in front of the servants sort of idea. He really does believe, but and in the Sage and the Atheist, he talks about, there will be justice. He definitely believes in, immortality of the soul. So it's not just a purely tactical thing.
Soul Doubt. And could you say a little bit about that book? Because I find it's a very interesting project. It's wide range. It's like from Luther to Martin Luther King Jr. to just about everyone in between. I just think it's a fascinating.
Yeah, well, thanks. King was just my sort of opening gambit. I sort of stopped with Marx really. But what I wanted to do is I started off looking at the Victorian crisis of faith. There's a well-known argument about ethical revolt being more important than Darwin. And I made some silly comments in a lecture I gave in Cambridge on this, where I sort of said, it's a British thing, we're so ethical, contrasting it with the French Enlightenment. And then I started looking at Bayle, to go back a bit further. Then I found Sebastian Castellio, and then I really found in Luther's own writing, you've got this dialogue. He has this strong doctrine of conscience that he develops from various kind of mystical writers, and a very effective doctrine of conscience, which is part of his great polemic against Aristotle and other scholasticism. And I thought that you actually could trace a history of conscience. And then when he discovers faith alone, conscience is sort of put down in its place. So I set it up as a sort of battle between sort of conscience and doctrine. I found that going all the way through to like Feuerbach, it's the same quarrel. Certain kinds of theology, says Feuerbach, particularly sola fide, gives you a free pass. That gives you an ethical, gives you too much ethical freedom in his view. And so that was the first draft. It was going to be this ethical theory. And then Bayle and Spinoza, it really became Project Spinoza, because Spinoza was the supreme embodiment, not just of a doctrine of reason, which is highly ethical, but also of a spirituality. That you couldn't say, this is, I started off with this idea that there was a sort of Kantian process of kind of the moral law within, sort of casting off the need for theology. But very few of the people I studied, fitted into that model. George Eliot, she'd be an example of someone who becomes an unbeliever, but there's an ongoing spirituality. I don't know if you know Tim Larson's book, The Crisis of Doubt, about sort of skeptics in the 19th century who reconvert to Christianity. So I became very aware of this sort of, it's not a one-way street, people convert back, but also I didn't find many out-and-out atheists. Marx is the only one who I would describe as a genuinely post-Christian thinker, even though he's still prophetic and biblical in different ways. So yeah, it's a history of conscience, but in a polemic against secularization. But I'm slightly regretting stopping with it anyway. I think it's we'll have to see.
One more thought, and I wonder if you would comment on it, and that is that Voltaire had the misfortune of dying for historical purposes right on the edge of the French Revolution, so that for somebody like Peter Gay, who does intellectual history with big ideas, big bookmarks, unlike Owen Chadwick, who spends a lot of time in the library, spent a lot of time in the library. There's a way in which Voltaire gets gravitationally pulled, our understanding of Voltaire gets pulled into the anti-clericalism of the French Revolution.
Yes. I mean, that's the crucial point, and Alex and I were talking about this earlier, that we talk about the Whiggish view of history and how it's flawed, but you sort of don't really get it until you realize how much of our study is conditioned by presentist implications. So if you're looking at this thinking, well, it's all footnotes or a procession to the French Revolution or a procession to Kant, then you just filter out all these unnecessary elements that don't really feed that discourse. And then the mission statement for me, and I forgot to mention this in my opening comments, was Christopher Hill's little phrase, the story looks different when you know or think you know how it ended. And the blinkers came off when I read that, and I realized how much my own commitment to secularization, how do we get into this mess? How do we get to sort of 2015 secular age? And if you look at it from the other end of the telescope, then it looks different. So yeah, Voltaire cannot be blamed. Just like Descartes can't be blamed. The idea that you can blame Auschwitz on the Enlightenment, that sort of thinking. So it's trying to get to origins rather than outcomes.
So speaking of origins and so on, so I think it seems to me that there's a common thread, that you kind of outlined, and that certainly happens in my century, in the 16th and 17th century as well, and that is this whole bugbear called Augustine, right, or Jansenist, right, and the notion that predestination is something that a lot of Christians were beginning to, it seems to me that there's a genuine problem that many are beginning to have around this period, right? So it could have easily been earlier on as well, of course, you got people arguing against Augustine when he was alive about his views. But what do you think was about this particular period, onward, that makes this idea so contestable and combustible that people like Voltaire et al. Will say, well, I'm not going to accept this version of Christianity. If this is the core of Christianity, I will have none of it. I mean, so even Peter Bale, he has some serious issues with that as well.
Yeah, that's a great question. Because, that is why Luther really is the intellectual or spiritual father of this, because of that sense of empowerment. And this sense of a conscience that isn't just morally alert, it is spiritually energized by a sense of divine access. And you see this with, when Christopher Hill's book and these evangelical radicals of the 17th century, you see it with, with Bale, people who are certain that they have a relationship with God, that they're right with God, are almost undisciplinable in a way, uncontrollable. There is a sort of potency to that is linked to not knowledge of the Bible, knowledge of what religion ought to be. And that's the point I make about George Eliot, is that she's absolutely an evangelical skeptic, because she has this articulacy. If you read Middlemarch, the discussion of the banker Nicholas Bulstrode, I mean, it's devastating. But here's someone who's been on the inside. She's telling him, she's preaching to him the whole way through. And so that's why I think it's linked to the Reformation. It's a form of spirituality that, yes, it does lose its spiritual definition over time, and it goes off in all sorts of different directions. Yet there's a sort of certainty there that you don't have before people have access to the Bible and have this sort of democratized. I mean, who is it who talks about the democratization of mysticism? Is that Stephen Osmond in the late 15th century? But there is this, it is linked to spirituality, and very much linked to biblical literacy.
I mean, John, do you wonder whether it has also something to do with the evangelical reading habits, right? So, George Eliot is, on the list of a lot of evangelical readers, but, she's the translator of David Friedrich Strauss's The Life of Jesus, right?
Yeah, and Feuerbach, yeah.
Oh, yeah, sure. And so I think there's so it seems to me that not only you got Peter Gay et al. Claiming Voltaire for their own side, but then many of the sort of Christian writers or scholars equally kind of distance themselves in what they're kind of heterodox from this and that and other. So it creates a real intellectual vacuum for them to be easily swept up as if they're one of us, it seems to me. So there's a lot of kind of revisionistic, post-revisionistic history that try to, I guess Europe will be in that. So David Sorkin, for example, about, do you know his?
No, I don't.
He's a Jewish scholar at the University of Wisconsin who's writing about this Judaism, Jews and Catholics and Protestants, how they're kind of tackling the sort of the working forces of secular Enlightenment rationality. So I think when I saw your book and when you extended the education, I thought that would be really a good way to kind of situate your work vis-a-vis the emerging historiography that rethinks secularism. So
yeah, well, I'd like to look at that book, but I suppose one of the issues we have is just how much the language defines it. It's really hard. You say, okay, I'm not going to use words like secularization, but it's hard not to use secular, or talk about religion as a construct of the early modern period. And where do we go without that? So it's finding a language. The balance I face is that I am still talking about unbelief of a form, and there is such a thing as classical Christian orthodoxy, and these people are fiercely destructive of it, and yet they're still Christians in many ways. It's hard to sort of find words to deal with it, really.
Yep, Alex?
You mentioned Sebastian Castellio, and I was wondering if Voltaire or any of these people are appealing to Castellio or to Repulsac or any of these other 16th century figures who are contemporaries of Calvin and Beza, were making a real fuss about the same thing, about turning God into a tyrant.
Yes, very much so. I mean, I don't know about Balzac, but Castellio is quoted by Grotius, and he influences all that kind of Dutch early Enlightenment, 17th century, and Voltaire cites him favorably a few times, but mainly to score points against Calvin. But there is definitely a stream of continuity there. There's a book by John Marshall about John Locke and early Enlightenment culture, which connects a lot of those, that radical Protestant world and the early Enlightenment. So, but yeah, he does quote him, but not extensively.
A similar figure I heard, does Richard Simon come up at all in Voltaire? I mean, he's a figure similar.
I don't recall him mentioning him, actually. Sorry, I can't say more than that.
It's a real pivotal figure, actually, in the history of biblical exegesis. So I think that is interesting that Voltaire doesn't really talk much about this. He wasn't that particularly interested in history of exegesis, or
no. Well, this is where Peter Gay and I are absolutely in agreement. I say it as if he's a slightly more influential scholar than me, but he says that the Enlightenment isn't an age of reason; it's a revolt against rationalism. He says there's almost an anti-intellectualism. He says there's a kind of beefy impatience for truth. That sort of doesn't want to get too much into the books. I mean, he says you haven't understood the Enlightenment until you've heard Samuel Johnson and Boswell coming out of church one morning saying, how can we refute, Berkeley's metaphysics, idealist metaphysics? They're saying, what a load of nonsense. But how can you refute it? We know it's nonsense. And then Johnson just kicks the nearest stone so hard he nearly falls over and says, I refute it thus. Now, Peter Gay says this is the 18th century. It laughs at the intellectual sophistication. It doesn't like to cite all its sources. So this is part of the problem with Voltaire is he's borrowing nearly everything off Bayle, but he puts it in his own words. So there may be influences but that aren't acknowledged.
all right. Well, it seems like that's an appropriate moment for us to end this part of the colloquium. We're going to have some wine and water and other goodies to share about. Our next one, which will be the last one of the semester, December 2nd, I believe, is going to be on a Monday, so it's a different day. Professor Daniel Boyarin from UC Berkeley is coming. And if you don't know anything about him, it'll be an intellectual piece. He's going to talk about, I think, the invention of Judaism and Jewish gospel. So I think he's going to, like this one, really looking forward to learning about Professor Boyarin's work. So without taking anything away from Dr. Erdozain, thank you very much for coming. And let's give it a
Thank you for having me.